Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
To the UK now, and the British Prime Minister has insisted that she's determined to get Brexit right, telling MPs we can prove the doomsayers wrong. Theresa May said she wanted a creative model for the UK's future relationship with Brussels, but admitted that ministers were preparing for the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. And to her Brexit-supporting Tory backbenchers came a bold challenge: accept existing EU regulations during a transition so we can get the deal we want. Our political editor Faisal Islam reports.
Back in Downing Street and off to the Commons after a conference break to forget. The PM seeking support from her troops ahead of a multitude of Brexit battles.
This dynamic, creative and unique economic partnership will enable the UK and the EU to work side by side in bringing shared prosperity to our peoples.
A measure of the pressure ahead, Jeremy Corbyn now seeing clear strategic gain in attacking the government's performance as a Brexit negotiator.
15 months on from the referendum, we're still no clearer what the future of this country will look like. The question must be asked, what on earth has the government been doing all this time?
From rebellious quarters on her own backbenches, support for the PM.
Forgive my throat, Mr. Speaker. Women with bad throats won't be silenced.
But a curveball from a pretender to the crown.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
That gave clarity on transition where once there had been fudge.
Will my right honourable friend confirm unequivocally that after the 29th of March 2019, the European Court of Justice's writ will no longer run in any way in this country?
We have to negotiate what will operate during that implementation period, and yes, that may mean that we will start off with the ECJ still governing the rules we're part of for that period.
That is an important clarification of the Florence speech, which means ECJ jurisdiction could extend as late as 2021, as the EU has indicated necessary for transition, part of her attempts to kickstart talks.
The ball is in their court, but I'm optimistic it will receive a positive response.
Unfortunately, over in Brussels, as the fifth round of negotiations began, the opposite message.
There has been so far no solution found on step one, which is the divorce proceedings, so the ball is entirely in the UK court.
On the face of it, the transition announcement, another victory for the Treasury in its battle, much criticised by Brexiteer Tories next door at the Foreign Office to cushion the economy from a cliff-edge Brexit.
Theresa May's issue is that she's having to play several different racket sports simultaneously, most notably in her own cabinet, where two big beasts have emerged, the Chancellor at the Treasury and Boris Johnson at the Foreign Office. These two men have different visions for where Brexit ends. That was fudged in the Prime Minister's Florence speech, but it can't last forever.
Tonight, the Foreign Secretary rode back spectacularly on his own red lines of just last month, backing the PM's pragmatism over the European Court of Justice in a social media post. He said, "Yes, we will mostly have to operate under existing rules during the transition, but we will be able to negotiate proper free trade deals." But elsewhere, Brexiteers out of cabinet sounding an ominous note for the PM.
The Prime Minister has gone as far as she could reasonably go, to some extent further than I would have wished her to go.
The question of whether or not the Court of Justice would remain fully in control of its jurisdiction over the United Kingdom after the 31st of March 2019, and that they would continue to make laws in relation to the period after that date, is the big question.
This crosses some Brexiteer red lines. Theresa May forcing her backbenchers into a compromise, a brave act given the past few weeks. Faisal Islam, Sky News.
Meanwhile, the UK government has for the first time laid out the consequence of a no-deal Brexit for customs. A white paper published after Theresa May's speech in the Commons said traders would need to be regulated and warned that ports like Dover would be the most complex problems to solve. Sky's senior political correspondent Jason Farrell reports.
For the first time, we see the government's plans for no deal, and it could have a significant impact on these lorries passing through Dover and the firms who rely on them. If there's no deal, the government paper warns that some traders will experience customs checks for the first time. So in the paper, the government describes this as a contingency scenario to have a customs system in place from day one. And what that means is that traders would need to be registered and providing them with an identification system. There would be imported goods liable to customs duty and import VAT, and certain goods may require import or export licenses. Now, the government says it will do everything it can to mitigate the impact, but they don't say here exactly how they would do that.
It's not just the UK that needs to be ready. The reasons that we had lorries stacking along the motorway in Kent in Operation Stack was not because of hold-ups at Dover, it was because of hold-ups on the other side of the channel as well. So there's a really interesting question about whether there is any parallel thinking going on in the EU about what they would do in the contingency of no deal.
Operation Stack 2 years ago saw huge queues on the M20 in Kent during disruption to the Eurotunnel and ferries from Dover. The paper warns that goods travelling in vehicles are likely to be most affected, as here the time available for processing declarations is shorter than at roll-on, roll-off container ports. The government says it doesn't want a no-deal scenario, but has to prepare.
Across Whitehall, a great deal of contingency work is underway to ensure that if we come to the end of the negotiating period and our European partners haven't been willing to come in to a deal with us, then we will leave without one. And what we set out today in our white paper on trade and our white paper on customs were some of the legal powers we would have to take to enable that to happen. But again, we hope that that won't be the case.
The paper recognises that the Irish border is one of the most complex areas with relation to no deal, with Theresa May insisting there should be no border infrastructure between north and south. This evening, the British Chamber of Commerce said that only 2% of its members support leaving without a deal. But by preparing for it, the government's warning EU negotiators that the UK is prepared to leave the table with no agreement. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Theresa May has given MPs her clearest indication yet that she is preparing for the possibility of leaving the EU without a deal. She announced proposals that will pave the way for just that and for the UK to operate as an independent trading nation post-Brexit. She said the ball is in the EU's court when it comes to the next stage of the negotiations. The EU, for its part, has said the ball is entirely in the UK's court. Well, our political editor Laura Koonsberg is in Westminster for us. So, Laura, both sides saying it's up to the other to make the next move.
That's right, Fiona. And in the last few days, Theresa May and the Tories have taken a political battering, partly at their own hands, as the cabinet appeared to be squabbling amongst themselves. But today, Theresa May's main job was to look like she's in charge, to look like she means business, as in Brussels, another round of those vital talks begin. Since she last went off to the Commons, she's survived an attempt to force her out, lost her voice in front of the nation. And if that's not all, ministers' antics have been fodder for the front pages. But the bigger job in hand is to get the Brexit talks moving.
Statement, the Prime Minister.
Theresa May trying, hoping to ignore the pressure on her. But first, to Tory nods, she said no deal might be an option.
While I believe it is profoundly in all our interests for the negotiations to succeed, it is also our responsibility as a government to prepare for every eventuality. So that is exactly what we are doing.
Her option now, to dismiss the enemies, not just with a shake of the head, but a determination to screw down on the other side.
And as we look forward to the next stage, the ball is in their court, but I'm optimistic it will receive a positive response.
Their answer to that claim, it's not me, it's you. There doesn't seem to be much of a mood for progress in this week's Brussels talks.
There has been so far no solution found on step one, which is the divorce proceedings. So the ball is entirely in the UK court.
Are you concerned about your own position?
And there are jitters in Brussels, as at home, about who's really in charge. The many characters of the Tory soap opera shaking up the plot. Vows of loyalty now aplenty.
I'm looking forward to the Prime Minister's statement.
But lots for Labour to poke fun.
Just at the moment when Britain needs a strong negotiating team, we have a cabinet at each other's throats. Half of the Conservative Party want the Foreign Secretary sacked. The other half want the Chancellor sacked.
We want both of them sacked.
If this government can't negotiate a deal for Britain, they should make way for a team that can.
But with the ground shaky beneath the Prime Minister's feet, competing Tory visions are on display. Should she push and push for a deal, or be ready to walk away?
They are still refusing to discuss the long-term relationship between the EU and the UK. When does she call time?
Was the Prime Minister saying that at the end of by March 2019, if we haven't got a deal as to the final Brexit arrangements, then we will jump off the cliff and there will be no deal?
Theresa May's problem, her party likes different answers to those same questions. Doing a deal with her own tribe, the country and the rest of the continent is hard enough. Well, Fiona, whether it's over if and when she would walk away, whether it's over the future potential rule of the European courts after Brexit, there are so many questions that the government isn't ready or willing to answer right now. But remember, in part, that's because they are locked in a negotiation. It's impossible for ministers to make some promises on the floor of the House of Commons here in Westminster that would box in their negotiators in Brussels. There are some demands that Tory backbenchers want to put on the Prime Minister that right now it's just impossible for her to commit to. That said, part of the problem is because inside the Tory party there is very far from universal agreement over exactly what she should be asking for. And in part too, it's because her authority has been under such attack, not just because of what happened at the Tory party conference last week, but also since the general election. The fact is, before she even thinks about exactly what she wants to get out of Brussels, Theresa May has a job every day, really, to keep showing her party and the country that she's really in charge.
Laura, Westminster, thank you.
Theresa May has told MPs that the government is preparing for every eventuality in the Brexit negotiations. She published 2 white papers this afternoon on new customs and trade arrangements that would allow Britain to operate as an independent trading nation. But as British and European officials start another round of negotiations in Brussels, both sides are insisting that it's up to the other to make the next move. And the sporting metaphors are bouncing around like, well, like tennis balls. As our political editor Gary Gibbon now reports.
A crunch point is approaching in the Brexit talks, and each side says it's the other one that's stopping progress. The ball's in Europe's court, the government briefed out this morning. In Brussels, the European Commission's spokesman hit back.
So the ball is entirely in the UK court.
And as we look forward to the next stage, the ball is in their court, but I'm optimistic it will receive a positive response. Because what we are seeking is not just the best possible deal for us, but I believe that will also be the best possible deal for our European friends too.
Brussels says there simply hasn't been enough progress made on phase 1 of the talks, issues like how much money Britain is willing to pull out of its back pocket to pay for leaving the EU, to allow them to proceed to phase 2 of the talks, negotiating the new trade relationship between the EU and Britain. The government here wants to keep a lot of money in its back pocket in case it could sweeten the final trade deal between the EU and Britain. Layered upon that is the massive complication of divisions, ruptures within the Tory ranks over what that final post-Brexit relationship should look like.
The truth is, the ball hasn't even been lobbed in Brussels' direction because Brussels is waiting for the negotiations within this government to be finished before this government is capable of negotiating with anybody else.
Foreign Secretary, what's your message?
It's fed into a battle for the Prime Minister's ear over cabinet jobs. Sack or demote Boris Johnson, some Tory MPs are telling Number 10, for being disloyal in pushing a harder Brexit. Others are saying it's time to clip the wings of the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, for the opposite thought crime.
Are we going to go back to the time when a few people in the cabinet sort of drove the Conservative Party in the direction that it didn't want to go? I don't think so. Philip's not like that. I think Philip's made it very clear he's supporting the Prime Minister.
You think you've got the numbers amongst the MPs and Philip Hammond hasn't?
Well, it's what the country wants, it's what the party wants, and there comes a point where the people advising ministers from the Treasury who've got it wrong over the years have to be told what the policy is going to be.
Just at the moment when Britain needs a strong negotiating team, we have a cabinet at each other's throats. Half of the Conservative Party want the Foreign Secretary sacked, the other half want the Chancellor sacked.
We want both of them sacked.
We want both of them sacked, one Labour MP shouted. Some Tory MPs wanted reassurance that she was ready to walk away from the talks.
Isn't it absolutely essential that we invest in preparations against the possibility of no agreement at all?
Yes, I can absolutely agree with my honourable friend on that, and that's precisely why that's exactly what the government is doing.
Not every government member has matching enthusiasm for that. Some think no deal would be easily weathered. Some think it could be catastrophic.
Well, Gary is in Westminster. Now, Gary, what did the Commons debate tell us about Theresa May's room for manoeuvre in the Brexit negotiations?
What she will have heard in that debate was an overwhelming number of Conservative MPs getting up and sharing their worry about slippage. They, most of them being Brexit supporters, the ones that spoke, worried that, although they didn't name him, that the Chancellor had pulled Theresa May in a certain direction for a sort of closer end settlement with Europe over the summer, and they were wanting to nail down certain things to make sure that, say, the transition wasn't going to be a permanent state, that no deal was definitely in play, constantly trying to nail these things down. It was a real theme of the afternoon. She won't have failed to have noticed that, and also Brussels won't have failed to have noticed that as well. She gave slightly more prominence to the idea of being ready to walk away, ready to go away with no deal than she did in her Florence speech. They will have definitely noticed that, and at the moment the best hope you hear in Whitehall is that maybe at the summit next week they might just get EU countries to agree that they will start preparing for trade negotiations, which they might allow to go ahead in December. Nothing more than that, and even that could be a long shot.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster.
There was one central question at Westminster today: deal or no deal? No, not the tea time game show, but our future relationship or lack of it with the European Union, with all that means for jobs, trade and the economy generally. This afternoon, recovered from her cough, the Prime Minister made clearer than ever to our European friends, as she called them, that she was prepared, if it comes to it, to drop out of the Union without a deal. If that cheered up the go-it-alone faction amongst the Brexiteers, what she had to say about the European Court of Justice went down rather less well. She indicated that the ECJ could still be governing our laws in the transition period after Brexit in March 2019, which was, to put it politely, like a red rag to the Brexiteer bulls.
Out of the Downing Street bunker, after 5 days, which were all about trying not to be evicted from here, to face her critics in the opposition parties and her own party, with a statement on the most contentious and complex issue of our age, how we're going to leave the European Union. And she began with a warning to other EU countries that she'd gone as far as she could in meeting their demands on the rights of migrants, the Northern Ireland border, and crucially, what we owe them.
The ball is in their court, but I'm optimistic it will receive a positive response.
And if it doesn't, well, she said she'd prepare this country for the dramatic step of a Brexit with no deal on security or trade.
And while I believe it is profoundly in all our interests for the negotiations to succeed, it is also our responsibility as a government to prepare for every eventuality. So that is exactly what we are doing.
To prove her point, the government published 2 proposals for legislation or white papers that would allow the UK to set customs and VAT with or without a negotiated EU settlement. He wasn't impressed with any of it.
16 months on from the referendum, no real progress has been made. The Prime Minister delivered yet another definitive speech, designed to herald a breakthrough, which instead only confirmed the confusion at the heart of government.
This was a funny old statement by the Prime Minister, because on the one hand she upset those in her own party keenest on an abrupt and clean severance of our relations with the EU by saying that for 2 years after we leave we'd still be subject to EU lawmaking and courts.
The government must be robust on this. It must be a red line, because otherwise we haven't left the European Union, and then the biggest democratic vote in British history will be being ignored. So it's really serious. It's a crucial point.
And on the other hand, the European Commission felt that her refusal to spell out precisely what we'll pay in a divorce bill meant that she'd misused that tennis metaphor.
There has been so far no solution found on step one, which is the divorce proceedings. So the ball is entirely in the UK court.
Theresa May chose to be Prime Minister, but there must be times during these Brexit negotiations when she deeply regrets that, because she's got to come up with a deal that prevents civil war in her cabinet, prevents civil war in her party, prevents civil war in the country as a whole, and is also acceptable to 27 other EU countries. Mission impossible. In fact, she knows that the most she can hope for is to please enough of our representatives here in Parliament to get our Brexit approved. But there'll be plenty of tears before we're properly out. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Well, if that was the view from here, our Europe editor James Mates is in Brussels tonight. James, we've had so much rhetoric, haven't we, from the start of this, but when you strip all that away, what do you assess the EU's leaders' attitude would really be to no deal?
I mean, the question is asked, how worried should you be when someone puts a gun to their own head and threatens to pull the trigger if you don't give in to their demands? I mean, there is widespread acceptance here that no deal would be very bad for the European Union, but catastrophically worse for Britain in terms of trade, in terms of the city, perhaps most of all in terms of the Irish border and what that would mean for peace. The sort of thing that maybe a strong government with a really robust mandate could put its people through and survive. And that weakness of Mrs May does worry them. Can she get the cabinet behind her? Though that decision that Robert was explaining on the European Court will have been seen as a step in the right direction here.
OK, well, this week, do you expect any movement at all, anything to shift?
Well, some optimism that there could be the makings of a compromise on citizens' rights. On money, though, we expect no progress, and all the problems here can be traced back to money. And it seems it's not really the European Commission that's playing hardball on this. It's France and Germany who are taking the really hard line, which means when Mrs May comes here next week for the Leaders' Summit to talk direct to those leaders, if it's still only the 20 billion on the table that she's been talking about so far, well, chances of a breakthrough will be pretty small.
OK, James, let's see. Thank you very much indeed.
So let's do more with Andrew Pearce and Kevin Maguire. Lots of Brexit stories following Theresa May's address to the House of Commons, and most pertinently, the idea that we are now putting contingency plans in place for no deal.
No, absolutely. She'll be pleased. The speculation isn't about whether she'll go, it's back on Brexit, but the talks are going pretty badly. And there could be no deal, which she raised back in January, then ran away from it and knew it would be catastrophic. There's now contingency planning going, and if there's going to be emergency measures to avoid gridlock at borders, we just call the M2 the Nigel Farage car park, because it'll just be stacked up all the way, and it is very difficult. And of course, you've got to prepare for the worst. You hope for the best. You hope you can move them in negotiations, but the other 27 are not shifting at the moment, and it's shown the weakness of her hand. She's got some cards, but it's weak. And again, they're saying they won't discuss trade, customs, future relationships until you sort those three issues round about EU citizens living in a Brexit Britain, the divorce payment, and Northern Ireland, what happens there. And so we're stuck. It's not the easy, simple, glorious, sunny uplands promised with the 350 million a week for the NHS and so on in the referendum campaign. Reality's biting home now, and it's pretty grim.
You see, Maguire still is stuck in a time warp. He's still aghast that we voted to leave, and he still can't bear it, and he still can't accept it, so he wants it all to unravel, as do most of those ghastly Remainers, like Nick Clegg, who can't come to terms with it either. But the fact is, a pretty strong hand we have got is saying, right, clear off then. You don't want to do a deal with us.
Go on, you 450 million people.
No, hang on, Kevin.
Off you go.
I'm talking. Going to say, you don't want to do a deal with us, we'll just walk away. So the 10 billion, because if we do go through to 2019 and there's a 2-year transition period, then we'll be paying our £10 billion. It's the second biggest net contributor. That's going to be 20 or 30 billion pounds. The EU hasn't got any money, and it can't afford to lose us, so it'll be desperate to get as much money as it can, and they're just in danger of losing the lot. And there'll be a lot of public support. There'll be a lot of public support if we do say, get stuff.
It's 45% of our exports. There'll be a lot of public support until people start losing their jobs.
Kevin, that's right.
And the economy actually does crash.
55% of our exports, hang on, 55% of our exports are beyond the EU, and if we don't have to do a deal, we can start doing our trade talks immediately. And that's what the EU don't want us to do. They don't want us to get into trade talks with other countries because they only want us to trade with them.
As you know, Liam Fox and Theresa May have effectively said we're going to just copy the trade deals with the EU anyway. They don't really need to go to these other countries to negotiate the deals. They just need to get a photocopier and take them.
I don't know.
Well, that's what's going to happen.
I don't know what you're talking about.
As if you're going to get your separate trade deals just like that. Trade deals are incredibly difficult to negotiate. America, for instance, will be America first.
How would
buy chlorinated
We've
chicken.
not been able to do a trade deal since we joined that wretched protectionist body called the Common Market, the European Union, which stops us doing trade with poor countries in Africa who can't sell us various agricultural products because of the EU, which is why we've got great poverty in Africa. So we're pouring all our international aid money into Africa when we could be doing trade with Africa.
Great.
And trade with the Commonwealth.
Great. Try and sell all those Nissan, Toyota.
You go on about the poor and starving in Africa, Kevin. What makes the poor and starving in Africa poor and starving is the EU.
Oh, God, blimey. That's a new one.
It's not a new one.
I mean,
it's a well-ventilated argument. Keep up.
I have problems.
You said that Theresa May would be glad to get onto substantive matters like the Brexit negotiations as opposed to her future. Is she safe now, do you think?
She is. She was saved by, look, the plotters, whoever they were scattered to the winds when we knew that the chief plotter was that political titan, Mr. Grant Shapps. Nice man, former Tory chairman, but Tory chairmen don't have the clout and stature they used to have. Yeah, why did you get rid of him then?
Did you not watch?
Why did you get rid of him?
No, I mean, he's quite an interesting bloke.
He's a nice bloke.
I mean,
he's a nice enough bloke, actually.
He got busy.
He called this one wrong, and he couldn't even get people like Nicky Morgan and Anna Soubry, who are well known to be opposed to Theresa May because she sacked them. He couldn't even get those on side, so it's gone away, the coup. That wasn't going to be a coup anyway. There's no appetite or clamour in the Parliamentary Party for a change of leadership.
When he was a newspaper reviewer on Sky, was he Grant Shapps or was he Michael Green? He's on with a very, get-rich-quick, filthy rich, that kind of fantasist. He was Grant. He wasn't Michael Green.
No.
So he came on as himself.
Did you check his name thing?
His badge, because he seemed to used to, switch between the two. Anyway, she is safe for now because they can't. They all hate her. Nobody respects her.
They don't hate her. They don't hate her.
Which is probably worse
that's not right.
But they can't decide which of them will take over after, and they're always the factions are frightened. The other one will come
the hatred is in your party. They don't hate Theresa May. She's a nice woman. She's a decent woman, and she's got a great sense of duty. Others might have said, "I'm just walking away from this."
I was at the Tory conference.
Who would blame her?
And has she neutered the arch Brexiteers with the news today about the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, which was one of Boris Johnson's red lines, which looks like we will now stay in for the 2-year transition period?
I'm not surprised by it. I mean, of course, most of us who wanted to leave the European Union are sick to death of the European Court telling us what we can and can't do. They should butt out. But while we're in the single market,
part of the European Court,
while we're in the single market and customs union, I guess we do have to go along with it. And what she's doing, Anna, there is she's signalling, I think, she's saying quite an important statement to the European Union. Now, will they then meet her halfway? Will they even move an inch? That ridiculous Barnier and even more ridiculous Jean-Claude Juncker Or are they too busy trying to sort out what's going on in Catalonia?
It's the charm offensive.
That's right. They don't care about what's going on in Catalonia. It's none of their business,
It's the charm offensive.
Astonishing, isn't it?
You couldn't find it on the map.
Astonishing.
The fact is, if in a transition period you're in the single market and the customs union, of course...
Well, that's what I just said.
Yeah, of course those judgments are going to impact on you. The big difference might be we won't have a judge. Because if you haven't got any MEPs after March,
hooray!
You don't have any commissioners.
Hooray!
Your ministers don't go into the council.
They'll be missed, won't they?
You'll be abiding by decisions, but you won't be having an input. So you'll be leaving without any leadership at all and no say.
Because MEPs show such great leadership, don't they?
No, but the point is that you have to take on...
really miss them.
You might have to accept the rule of new laws having had no impact in their creation.
Well, we've only got 29 out of 400 and so. I mean, I don't think it really matters that much, really.
Well, you wait until MEPs start getting tough on the terms of the departure, then you'll see.
Well, then we'll walk away. You can tell what to do by that lot.
You sound
who get less than 30% of the national
sound
votes.
like the sheriff in blazing saddles who put the gun to his head and said, "If you move, I'm going to shoot." Well, that's what you said. That's what walking away is. You would harm yourself. That is why they don't want to do it.
At least I don't look like the sheriff.
Is anyone following this? Because I know I'm not.
He was a bit of an old...
Let's move on, shall we?
He wasn't exactly handsome, Anna.
Yeah, OK.
No, I think you've got the wrong sheriff.
No, I haven't.
I think you have. But anyway...